Hello, I'm Nick Park, Executive Director of Evangelical Alliance Ireland, and this is our weekly message. It's Friday, but Sunday's coming. Well, we had an announcement from the Taoiseach last night, and the end of the lockdown, the end of the long lockdown is coming. And science is giving us reason to believe that this will not be another temporary respite. I think we all knew whenever things were loosened up at Christmas that the way the science and the numbers was going, that there was going to be another lockdown following at some stage afterwards. However, now we see so many signs as regards the situation nationwide that would give us much more hope that that will not be the case. And of course, we're all praying for that. We're praying that we're not going to go back into any more lockdowns. However, two things have been highlighted now in the Taoiseach's announcement and events of the previous week. One was a piece of secondary legislation that was passed by the government criminalising public gatherings during the pandemic, which of course were already, we all understood they were forbidden, but now they were criminalised, and that included gatherings for religious services during the lockdown. Now, this was all to do, and let me just explain, I wanted to make sure I'm not a lawyer. I am a pastor. I am a Christian leader, but I'm not a lawyer. So I've consulted with a barrister, an expert in the Constitution about this. And this is what I have been informed, is that this is all to do with a court case that Vincent Ganley was bringing against the government. And it was about religious services being banned. And Vincent Ganley was arguing his case on two grounds. One was on constitutional and human rights grounds, that churches have a constitutional right to meet even during a pandemic. And the court has to make a decision on that. Of course, we have rights guaranteed us by human rights treaties and by our constitution. Now, it is recognised that those are not always absolute in law. That there are, for example, we have a right of freedom of movement, but obviously you don't have freedom of movement out of Irish airports at the moment because there is a pandemic. So anyway, Vincent Ganley was arguing on two grounds. One was on the constitutional and human rights level, and we're waiting with interest to see what the court will eventually decide on that. The other was that there was a loophole in the legislation that actually, on strict legal grounds, there wasn't any prohibition against worship, that it was simply advice. Now, the government had to clarify that, and, well, what they did, they passed this secondary legislation and basically closed that door on the Ganley case. Now, as a legal tactic, well, that's probably what the lawyers advised. Maybe from a purely legal sense, in defending themselves against a court case, that made sense to the government. But in terms of relationships with the churches in this land, it was a slap in the face for the church. And a slap in the face that we didn't deserve. Because although there's been one or two exceptions, by and large, churches of all denominations in our land have really sacrificed and bent over backwards to protect people, to operate safely, and to really make great sacrifices for the public good. And I think churches, and the Taoiseach himself has said churches should be commended for that. So suddenly this criminalisation of worship during the pandemic and lockdown really came across to the church as a slap in the face. Now, where do we go from here? Well, the court may still find in Vincent Ganley's favour on the constitutional and the human rights aspects of his case. Now, as regards the loophole, that has now been closed. And actually, I mean, in 10 days' time, worship services will no longer be prohibited anyway. But there are longer-term implications. And so that court case will eventually be decided, and we will hear whether the government actually had the right to prohibit public worship services during the lockdown, or whether there was a constitutional and human rights reason why the government couldn't prohibit that. We'll wait and see. However, one thing we do need to say is this. that the government's action in their secondary piece of legislation does not increase the likelihood or possibility or make it any easier for a future dictatorial government to act in discrimination or persecution against the church. If they're going to do that, they would do that irrespective of what our current government did last week. We just pray we don't get that kind of government in this country. But there's an important thing we need to ask ourselves. The Christian church has received an undeserved slap in the face from the government. How do we respond to a slap in the face? Now, if we weren't Christians, that would be quite easy. We slap back. We do an act of defiance or retaliation. But Jesus, of course, had quite a bit to say about how we behave in such circumstances and how we should respond to a slap in the face. Now, we can certainly make our feelings known to government, and many church leaders have done that, both publicly and privately. That's good. That's their right. But we don't slap back. And so we are not, at EAI, we are not going to treat the government as the enemy. We continue to pray for government. We continue to dialogue with government. We will, of course, resist any government actions that target the church or discriminate against the church, treating it differently from other public gatherings, or try to restrict our freedom to hold and to practice our faith. But despite receiving a slap in the face, we have no wish and no desire as Christians to slap the government back in any shape or form. Now, what about worship now? Because worship after the 10th of May, what is it going to look like? Well, for most churches, of course, that will effectively be Sunday the 16th, although there's nothing to stop churches holding midweek services on Monday the 10th. That would be the first date that legally we can hold church worship services again. So there's nothing to stop churches holding midweek services, but Sunday the 16th is our first Sunday we're looking at most churches worshipping in-person services again. Now, distancing and face coverings, we have already been told, will still apply. I think most of us expected that. Other advice that was in place during the last time before this last lockdown, we don't know. We're waiting for clarification, and no doubt there will be a lot of discussion over the next 2 weeks. However, one of the most concerning things, as far as I am concerned, is that there is a limit of 50 people. Now, before, when we were open, both in the summer and at Christmas, there was a limit of 50 people, but there was also a protocol where in larger buildings, larger numbers could be accommodated by having zones of 50 that used each zone to use a separate exit entrance and 4 meters between zones and no crossover between them. And therefore, it was possible, for example, in a very large building to have more than 50. And the church I pastor, we were able to have 2 zones and therefore 100 people in worship. For larger churches, limit of 50 is going to be extremely difficult. We have many churches in this land that have many hundreds of attenders. And to just be limited to 50 in each service is going to be very onerous indeed. EAI has already written to the Taoiseach's office about this. We did so within 1 hour of the announcement being made when we realised there was no mention of the protocol to allow larger buildings to accommodate larger numbers. And no doubt other church leaders and bishops will be approaching the government about this. So we will see what happens over the next 2 weeks. We've in previous reopenings, we have found that things progress and we can move things along, and the government is amenable to bringing in some innovative ways to try and facilitate worship better. So please pray that that will be the case this time as well. Look, we at EAI, as with all other denominations and church movements, we will be doing everything possible over the next 2 weeks to keep church leaders and individual Christians updated and informed about how we can cooperate with the authorities to meet requirements, but also to worship in ways that are meaningful and that give all of our people an opportunity to worship the Lord. So please do follow our website, www.evangelical.ie, and also our Facebook page, Evangelical Alliance Ireland. And as developments happen, we will keep them there. But I would say this, even with certain restrictions in place and everything else, we can see light at the end of the tunnel in this whole mess that's been going on around the world for over a year now. And we are determined to keep lifting up the name of Jesus. We are going to keep praying. We believe there are better days ahead because it might be Friday, but Sunday's coming.